Hello and welcome. I'm Ros Bullied, Green Alliance's Research Director and Chair of this debate on different approaches to decarbonising the UK's building stock, and particularly the new homes that the UK so much needs. Before you all shout at your screens, there are obviously ways of aligning conservation and densification and other important considerations of things like preserving heritage, creating a sense of place and ensuring livability. However, it's also fair to say that there are not always compatibilities as well between those different things. And different approaches can rub up against each other. On the one hand, bearing in mind the considerable carbon emissions associated with creating construction products like iron and steel, there's a strong case of preserving as much of the existing building stock as possible. On the other hand is the need for more compact towns and cities, which make it easy to walk and to take public transport. That ideal may require demolition and replacement of some existing sprawl. Green Alliance has a foot in both camps, with a recent report finding raw material use can be cut by a third using current techniques in the construction sector, and another one out soon looking at options for densification. So I'm excited to hear how this discussion pans out. We've got two expert and interesting speakers to bring out the pros and cons of different approaches. We'll start with Professor John Barrett from Leeds University, and then hear from Anthony Breach, a senior analyst at the Centre for Cities, before opening things up for a discussion. Please put any questions in the Q&A box and feel free to discuss at other points in the chat. So John, over to you, and perhaps you could start with a bit of background on your work and where you're coming from on this issue.
Great. Thank you, Ros, and welcome to everyone. So I'm Professor in Energy and Climate Policy from the University of Leeds, and I've worked extensively on producing low energy scenarios for the UK to understand how we can achieve our legally binding emission targets and exceed them if possible, because the evidence is very clear that while we do have ambitious targets, going faster and further is definitely needed, according to, I suppose, the IPCC's reports, which demonstrate the rapid need for change at the global level. So I want to start really by starting from that climate perspective, which I think potentially is not always given the attention it should within the planning process. And let's just sort of think what we need to achieve in the UK. So the UK from this year needs to reduce its emissions by 33% by 2035 to meet its legally binding target. That means annual reductions around 2.8% a year, and historically from 1990 up to 2022 it's averaged at 1.4%, so that's double the effort that we've ever seen historically. And the government's own analysis and forecasts show and demonstrate that we're going to keep going around that 1.4% reduction rate for the next 5 years. And if we do that, that means that we're putting more pressure on the end of that time between 2028 and 2035. And that would mean 7.5% annual reduction. And if we leave it to 2030 at that rate, then we're looking at a 10% annual reduction in emissions to meet our legally binding targets. Now, when have we reduced 10%? When have we had 10% reduction in emissions in the UK? There's 2 years. 2009, when there was a global economic crash, and also the global pandemic in 2020 also resulted in a 10% reduction. So that gives some sense of the scale and also some insights into the urgency that's needed in the short term. And so therefore, if we take into account the planned improvements in carbon intensity over that time period, the UK is probably going to have to reduce its energy demand by 20% to stay inside its legally binding targets. And so this means reducing the use of the most carbon intensive materials attached with these highly carbon intensive processes. And clearly steel and cement can be included within that category. So I should make it clear that I'm not denying the benefits of densifying cities. It's a necessary step to allow active travel to bloom, smaller compact living, reducing heating needs and community cohesion, just to name a few. However, our legally binding target means that no sector is exempt from this transformative change. And therefore, it's when carbon intensity is most high, which is in the next 5 years, that every single resource efficiency strategy needs to be explored. And that is the time when it's of most importance. And that means extending the life of building foundations and structures which carry most of the embodied energy of the building. So just a few things to consider then, and to prioritise before we go down knocking down cities. Firstly, it's to question how big the shortage really is. There are 250,000 empty homes in the UK. Empty homes data by council area shows that due to underinvested areas with extremely high numbers of low-term empties, that there is space to utilise that, particularly in the northeast and northwest. The debate is often focused very much around the southeast, as opposed to improving locations elsewhere. There's also over 800,000 second homes in the UK. And if we're really trying to be as resource efficient as we can, then we need to target these homes which are empty for considerable periods and have actually increased by 13% in the last decade. There are 26 million spare rooms in the UK, and policy options to improve the occupancy rates of these homes. And we also need to question who these homes are for. We must stop building the wrong homes. 50,000 affordable homes were completed in 2022 out of 200,000. New homes need to be built to provide homes, not investments. And therefore, there's a real danger that the densification debate could also mean gentrification. And we really need genuinely affordable, rented and socially rented homes. And government policy has very much encouraged the treatment of housing as a form of speculative investment, as opposed to meeting basic human needs. If we are going to then try and densify cities, which, as I say, is important, we need to really make sure that we've taken all measures first to ensure that the embodied energy of existing structures are utilised as long as possible. Significant shifts in working practices from working at home mean there is room for conversion of offices into housing units, and there are numerous examples of successful conversions. And we really need to make sure that we've taken advantage of these opportunities before exploring demolition. And it goes without saying that any home that we do build, we want to make sure it's well insulated, it has the latest technology, heat pumps, electrification for heat, and that we're not in a situation where we need to refit them within the next 10 years. So thank you for listening.
Thanks, John. I'll hand over to Anthony now. Perhaps Anthony as well, you could give a bit of background to Centre for Cities and your approach.
Yes, sure thing. So thanks, Ros, and thanks, John, for that introduction. So my name's Anthony. I'm a senior analyst here at Centre for Cities, where I lead on housing and planning. So just to give a bit of background about who we are, Centre for Cities is a think tank research organisation that looks at the performance of the UK's urban economies and the contribution they make to local living standards and also to the national economy. So while there are other organisations out there that focus on engineering or design or architecture or planning, we don't really look into those kind of things. We're really focused on how cities work as labour markets. Right? People move to cities to get a job. And what this means, I think, in the kind of climate debate is that there's going to growing calls around changing how we use the built environment and our process of making decisions about the built environment, which are coming quite rightly from a perspective that is increasingly sensitive to our legal obligations on climate and carbon emissions. But some of these can come from quite specific and quite siloed kind of approaches. And what we do at Centre for Cities is we try to look to how cities work together, looking in terms of their labour markets, in terms of urban mobility, how people get around the city, but also at their land markets as well, and the built environment. So we make the observation in the climate debate and the net zero obligations that we have, that cities are economically efficient in that they allow people to share ideas better, to share infrastructure, and to share land and buildings together. And that's part of why they're efficient. But that same efficiency is also why they are environmentally efficient. So cities, by consuming less land area, by having to use less infrastructure to move people around, by having a greater concentration of people within a particular place, cities reduce the pressure that human civilization puts upon the natural world. And we can see this in the carbon emissions data, and that by our calculations, the average resident of an urban area emits about 4 tons of carbon per year, whereas the average non-urban resident emits about 6 tons of carbon per year. So urban living is good for the environment and it's good for the climate. The challenge really, especially in terms of the economic program, where how we continue to support high living standards and economic growth alongside meeting our climate obligations, is how do we get more of both of those things, both the economic efficiency that cities provide and the environmental efficiency that cities provide. And in the process of delivering that, when we look at the UK's urban form and the UK's built environment, what really stands out relative to our European peers and even kind of the nature of even some American cities as well, is that British cities are unusually low density. They have a low-rise urban form pretty much uniformly outside of particular pockets. And what that means is because they are low density, because you have this kind of one-story, two-story urban form across the vast majority of the built-up areas of UK cities, is we don't get either the full extent of those economic efficiencies or those environmental efficiencies that we should be getting from urban Britain. So to give you, an implication of that for the climate debate is delivering further carbon reductions in carbon emissions from the UK economy means Britain needs to be more urban. Its urban areas need to be denser in the right places, but that also means replacing some of the existing building stock with newer and denser buildings to allow us to share infrastructure and to share urban areas to greater degrees than before. So to give you, a couple of examples, 500 meters from the centre of the city's office at London Bridge, if you go towards Borough Market and you could walk on a little bit further, you will see within walking distance of 2 London terminals, quite a low-rise housing estate of between 1 and 2 stories, which maybe houses, perhaps kind of 50 households or so. If this was a much denser development, whether that was for housing, whether that was for office and for commercial uses, that would enable people to live within London city centre or to work within London city centre, use the public transport that's widely available, use cycling infrastructure, walk around more within London, and enjoy a high quality of life and a prosperous life, while also not relying on fossil fuel transport or indeed kind of the embodied carbon emissions that come from motorised vehicles. But so demolishing those kinds of low-rise urban environments that are within easy access of public transport and replacing those with new, not necessarily high-rise, but certainly mid-rise and considerably taller buildings than what we currently have is good for the environment. So there are further extensions of that. If you walk around train stations, in other parts of the country, you'll often find that it's semi-detached houses, it's low-rise housing, or even kind of fields and green belt within walking distance of train stations. So making better use of our transport infrastructure and our urban infrastructure with demolition and reconstruction in walking distance of those facilities is quite important. But I think it's also alongside those kind of environmental benefits that come with demolitions, I think it's also important for increasing living standards and for the and for economic benefits as well. So this maybe I think there's some agreement between John and I on the benefits of dense cities, but there is fundamentally a housing shortage in the UK, and if we're serious about tackling inequality and improving quality of life for pretty much everybody in the country, we do need more houses and more dwellings. So we've done research finding that even once you account for things like second homes and for empty homes, the UK is still missing about 4.3 million homes relative to the European average, which we've not built since 1955 as a result of our planning system. But even on metrics such as the number of empty homes we have, only about 1% of homes are long-term empty, which is much, much lower than, say, I think Netherlands, where it's about 3%, parts of Japan, where it's up to kind of 5–10% or so. All kind of the indicators when you look into it indicate we've got a very, very severe lack of urban floor space that we need to increase if we're serious about improving economic conditions and living standards, and working out how we do that alongside minimizing our impact on the climate and planet. Is the policy challenge facing the UK today. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Anthony. So I think both of you have made quite compelling cases. Somehow we both need to preserve the building stock and the materials in it in the short term, super urgent, particularly while those materials are carbon intensive to produce. And yet somehow we do also need to evolve to this sort of more dense urban form. But obviously those it's quite hard to do both at the same time. So just wondering if you have thoughts on how we can actually kind of square that really pressing immediate urgency that John talked about with the kind of longer term vision Anthony talked about as well. Maybe if Anthony, if you want to go first, and then maybe we'll hand over to John.
Yep, sure thing. So I think John's right that we have kind of our legal obligations that are quite stark, and they kind of the impact of construction in kind of the climate emissions is quite considerable. I think where I am kind of interested, and I think there's been a lot of debate in Europe about this, and increasingly in the United States, is are there changes we can make in the short and medium term to the materials that we're using in form of construction that can significantly reduce our impact on the built environment in the short and medium term. So obviously, I think there are kind of crazy frontier level technologies, being created by laboratories, of vastly reducing the emissions of cement, hydrogen-powered steel, those kind of things. They're not going to be deployable within the next kind of 10, 15 years, if they are ever going to be deployable, and that's kind of a separate debate. But one thing that's quite common in the UK, what's really uncommon in the UK, is our use of wood construction. So in large parts of Europe, it's quite common to use mass-based timber, which is basically kind of giant logs, which to deliver kind of mid-rise apartment buildings. Although these don't have quite the fire risk that you might initially think, because they are both treated, and it's also quite difficult to burn large chunks of wood relative to kind of small planks, which make up a lot of kind of the American building stock, which we have in the US. So I think there are kind of changes we can probably make to our building regulations in the short term that mean we can help decarbonize our construction sector quite significantly in the short and medium term, not completely, which are within reach. But I think it's in the medium to long term, there are going to have to be some technological changes that need to happen to properly decarbonize as much as we can the construction sector. But also, I think if we're really thinking kind of seriously about what is the long-term impact of carbon emissions we're emitting today on long-term climate change outcomes, either 60 years from now, 100 years from now, 100 years, 200 years from now, changing the built environment of cities is hard, and it's slow, and it takes a long time. And at least getting into kind of the mindset where we agree that demolition and replacement of some buildings, right, which are well served by public transport, which could be denser, which could allow these kind of changes in lifestyles. At the very least, there should be an intellectual agreement that demolition shouldn't be off the table, but rather it's perhaps a question of when, perhaps a question of technology, but it's going to happen if we're serious about delivering permanent improvements and reductions to our carbon emissions.
Okay, thanks very much. John, thoughts on kind of how you square the circle?
Yeah, sure. So, well, yes, we can build buildings better. There's considerable evidence of buildings with 30–40% less embodied carbon, which are built to last, which use wood or other materials. So there are examples of doing this better. I think what is slightly misunderstood about the climate debate sometimes is this sense that it's at some point in the future where we have to reduce emissions. Climate change is a cumulative emission problem. It's about the build-up of emissions over time, and therefore when you want to reduce material use most is when you're producing those materials at the greatest carbon intensity, and that is the next 5 years. So my feeling is that to explore all options before demolition is really important, so that we actually balance out our cumulative emissions over time. And so therefore it is in those next 5 years where I recognise the need for more homes. 4.3 million, I think, was the figure that Anthony mentioned. But if we have 1 million homes which are second home and not occupied, clearly there is a starting point there. There are opportunities for conversion of office blocks to high density. And also, I think we do need to think about, if we have a limited carbon budget over time, how do we want to spend that budget for the value and the greatest value of citizens in the UK? And of course, allocating homes to do that seems like a very sensible thing to do. But Anthony, you mentioned development in London there. It wouldn't surprise me if that potential development, if that development was built and the one-bedroom flat started at £1 million, and in essence exclude people who potentially could afford them. So it seems to me the alignment of all these issues is really important. And one thing I think this does mean is that we need to move away from our housing system being defined by what investors want to do and actually defining what communities want, which then have the opportunity to prioritise and maximise the existing structure, but also, and I buy into this as well with Anthony, a vision of how we densify cities so that active travel becomes, I suppose, our main form of mobility in the future. So I think it's about a short-term, a long-term plan, but it's a plan in essence that is there, which is taken control of, and not one that's just left for investors. And then we see if it happens to randomly end up being something that we want or not.
Thanks, John. That takes us into the quite large area of planning and how you might govern this kind of system. Do you have any confidence that there is the capacity and the ability to make these kind of rational decisions that might be able to balance kind of the kind of long-term carbon impacts of the material choices against densification? And if not, without launching at length into kind of redesigning the planning system, have you got any quick suggestions as to how that should be working better? And
yeah, sure thing. So I think kind of the kind of key tension, I think, with kind of what John said there is, like kind of allowing more communities kind of more control over the built environment and how that changes, then clashes quite strongly with then the actual experience we have of how communities interact with the planning system, which is often to really resist new development in general, but in particular denser, taller, and more kind of, through land use terms, more environmentally sustainable development. And the connection between bigger buildings and more buildings, and then actually on the margin, this being actually quite an environmentally friendly building, is not always obvious to communities. I think in the, as you said, I have very strong views about, a complete kind of shift from our current discretionary case-by-case planning system, where you can propose something that complies with the plan and it can still be rejected, moving from that to what we call a flexible zoning system, where if you follow the rules, then you can build. That's something which we think it has both environmental benefits, but will particularly be good for those economic and for those housing benefits. But I think even in kind of the short term, some of the things that could be done are, building on kind of train stations in the Greenbelt. We've calculated the numbers on this. We can maybe build around 1 million in train lines going to central London, 1 million at train stations going into the cities in the rest of England on less than 2% of the Greenbelt. So it's like, it's not just about kind of demolition, it's about providing new homes in places where there is infrastructure that is climate friendly. I think there's also stuff that can be done with local development orders, which are a very specific kind of planning tool, which would introduce much more rules-based decision-making and certainty into the process, plopping some of those down in existing built-up areas around places that are suitable for this kind of densification would be a positive thing. I think there's kind of a mix of things. I think John's got a really interesting point there about those first 5 years and about how, what do you do when we're currently at the most carbon intensive that we should be for the remaining sort of future of the British economy. I think there's a bit of a risk that the next 5 years beyond whatever point we're at is always going to be less carbon intensive than the point we're currently at. But I think if it's the case that actually by putting up a load more wind farms, putting a load more solar farms or nuclear, however we decarbonize the grid, whether there's kind of new technologies quite imminently on the horizon, that mean as you say, that kind of integration rather than differential calculus problem of carbon emissions means it's more carbon friendly to do demolitions 10 years from now rather than 2 years from now. Then I think there's a really, if the math stacks up that way, then the math stacks up that way. But the underlying principle of densification being good for the environment, I think still stands. I think perhaps as both John and I both agree.
Thanks. John, I mean, you said a few words on the kind of planning system before, but any additional thoughts on that and how it treats kind of materials and the carbon, the climate change challenge?
Yes, I think this probably, well, it would be about the regulations and standards in terms of building that needs to be clearly aligned. We are in a position where we could have carbon intensity per metre squared figures, which could be achieved, which vested interests would fight against, but it is possible to put in such processes to ensure that we are maximising the benefits of building better quality homes with lower embodied emissions. So maybe it's the alignment of policy, which is probably the answer almost to every single challenge that we ever face, about the consistency across the board from building regulation through to planning, through to climate policy, through to ensuring it delivers for local communities. So in that respect, I think it's the alignment that becomes really important in this process. I suppose as well, and one challenge to face, and I think there was a question that alluded to this as well, is that we will actually benefit over time from the electrification of mobility. And therefore, hopefully, we will see reductions in doing that. But I suppose, and maybe more work here is needed, but examples where we can have active mobility at lower density, because from a cultural perspective, it's difficult to see how we have mass clearance of Victorian terraces in many cities. It's difficult to see why we can ensure that future developments do offer densification. The mass wipeout and the cultural sort of significance of those homes seem difficult. So we also have to be aware that we've also got to work from where we're starting from, as opposed to where we might ideally wish we were. And that really ensures how can we actually develop active travel and the benefits of densification at lower levels of densification in cities where we are unlikely to be able to have such a radical revolution.
Thanks, John. Some really interesting points in there. And actually, it leads on to my next question, which was going to be around how you incorporate that sort of sense of place and the cultural connections people to feel to areas. If you were to sort of start from scratch and bulldoze all the Victorian terraces, for instance, as John suggests, you might be in danger of creating quite a uniform kind of cityscape, which wouldn't appeal to everyone. And that wouldn't also be, it would potentially be counterproductive in terms of kind of sustainability as well. We saw the 60s kind of a lot of 60s concrete being removed subsequently with, not entirely good from a consumption emissions and embedded carbon point of view. So yeah, I'll come to you on that, Ant, and then John, if there's other bits on that. I think the other thing that I was going to quickly ask about before we open the questions up more broadly, just about the potential impact of densification on the kind of heat islands and whether there's anything that we need to bear in mind on the climate adaptation front as well, particularly given the recent weather in Europe as well.
Yeah, sure thing. So I think on the, you're totally right that it's, we've got to start from where we're coming from. I think we also have to accept sort of the cultural proclivities of the English-speaking world, right? Kind of gardens and castles and all that stuff. We're not going to get everyone sort of in Berlin or Vienna style mid-rise apartments over the next 20 years. The vast majority of people are going to want to continue living in suburbs, and they're going to want a lifestyle that's congruent with that, and that's fine, right? As you say, kind of making ensuring more of those suburban houses are within reach of train stations, thinking about other things we can do on bike infrastructure to make those a bit more attractive. I think there is work to be done, and reform of the planning system that can be done to help achieve that. On the kind of regeneration points, we did a report last year kind of looking at the King's Cross example, right, which I think is probably sort of the gold standard for regeneration in the UK at the minute. I think what we found from that is that it's quite expensive and quite difficult to deliver, regeneration of that high quality, which I think pretty much everyone agrees has been a success. But it's difficult to roll that out, especially in places which have lower land values than London. But one of the problems that makes it so difficult is actually kind of the uncertainty of the planning system. It's so unpredictable. You just massively push out the timelines on redevelopment. You make it less viable to do that kind of regeneration in parts of the country that aren't London. And in particular, because it's so difficult to, if you're a private developer, to assemble different bits of land, put them all together into one big site where you can do a redevelopment of this scale and do a mid-rise development, because ultimately the process is uncertain. You can assemble all of that land and you can still be denied a planning permission, and all of this kind of upfront costs falls upon you because the planning risk has been so severe. There are very strong disincentives from how the current planning system works that make it too risky to do that kind of high quality aesthetic regeneration in large parts of the country purely from private sector, and you need public sector then to intervene. So I think that there's other stuff we can do as well on planning reform to make that process more certain and to make it more viable to deliver that kind of high quality regeneration outside of London. I think also, I think the cooling debate, I think is another good one. Another kind of really important kind of safety issue as well. It almost feels like it's like a separate webinar, but I think in urban heat island effects are real. I think in the process of adaptation is probably going to involve more mechanical cooling and more air conditioning, especially once we decarbonize the grid and essentially have heat pumps installed everywhere which function as air conditioning units. Ensuring we have kind of widespread adaptation of that kind of technology, I think seems to me to be the most obvious way in which you would deal with that, along with planting trees and water features and other things that keep the outdoors environment shaded and cool.
Thanks, Ant. So there's still some space for green places in your dense cities. I'm pleased to hear. John, and thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, so it's been an increased reliance on I suppose electrical cooling is going to be a major problem, and lots of the analysis shows that particularly in areas like London, then it will overtake heating pretty quickly in the long term. So therefore that obviously has to be built into design, and I can't see that happening by chance. I can't see suddenly us wanting to develop passive cooling systems and also get the density right so that it is balanced with green space unless we specifically plan to do so. And that really has to be built into the process to take account of climate adaptation as well as mitigation options. So my feeling is that I'm confident that all these options exist and less confident that they're going to happen. And therefore, in reality, and I think this is actually when we look a lot across climate change mitigation options, we actually have at our fingertips pretty much all the options available to us to deliver that emission reduction in a very short amount of time. We simply are not taking charge of the situation and ensuring that future development meets the needs to deliver that. And therefore, I suppose whether it's planning regulation or it comes through building or it comes through some other mechanism, I don't care, but I want to see it happen and I want to see it take place. And it seems to me that the evidence in the past is that purely leaving it to investment, private investment, that will not happen. And also leaving it for private home building companies now that are building homes probably 5-10 years ago, which need retrofitting already. Also gives us evidence this isn't going to happen without serious intervention. So I remain sceptical without significant intervention from a policy perspective, I suppose.
Thank you. If slightly depressing message about deliverability, which seems consistent across quite a lot of areas in which we work. So moving over to the questions from the audience now. One of the first ones was, we have touched on this, but maybe you could explore it in just a little bit more detail. And that's whether the Centre for Cities analysis accounts for the fact that we will be decarbonising the transport system. Does that really alter the argument for densification in the longer term? I think that was for Anthony, that one.
Yeah, so I think it will reduce kind of the margin, like, the spread between 6 tons and 4 tons would be my expectation. But as well as that, I think this is actually an area in which kind of embodied carbon actually does become really important, right? Because, as well as the embodied carbon that comes from building new buildings, there's also embodied carbon that comes from building vehicles, right? And if we induce kind of a land use pattern that makes densification really difficult, we force people to live, more people to live a kind of low density, low rise urban lifestyle than they would want to, right? And there's a bunch of evidence that suggests some people on the margin would like to kind of live closer to transport, to live closer to urban cores than they do currently, even if most people want to continue living in the suburbs. If we continue to have that kind of low-rise kind of environment, we're still going to have kind of embodied carbon emissions that come from the vehicles we're building and people are driving around, even if they're all electric vehicles as well. So while, I think there is, decarbonising kind of a transport sector will make some difference, those kind of fundamental efficiency gains that come from sharing land, from sharing infrastructure, from sharing buildings are really permanent. And, regardless of your level of decarbonisation of the energy sector, those are always going to be real. And also, they're going to be combined with economic benefits and agglomeration effects as well.
Thank you.
Could I add to that one?
Yep, yeah, do.
So the scenarios which we produce show that electric vehicles cannot do this alone. And I think that's still a myth. And we've seen DFT step back slightly on the demand side in association with mobility, and without the demand side, then transport will take far bigger than its fair share of the carbon budget. It's one of the only areas where we've actually had no reduction over the years. So we also have major problems with vehicle sizing, which continue to increase. So we do need to free people from car ownership. And by free, I mean actually free them from the high costs associated with it, and actually the mutual co-benefits of healthier living through active travel. But we do also need to be clever enough not to just do this within specific cities. And therefore, we will have to come up with approaches of how do we ensure active travel and shared mobility within towns of lower density, as well as obviously where it makes more sense within cities. And just one other quick thing to say on transport is obviously we always refer to land transport. And while we always think that cities are greener, look at the London footprint of its residents in terms of aviation, and it's shocking. So the provision of I suppose, aviation and air travel with London is significantly higher than other parts of London. So when we look at the consumption-based emissions and the full supply chain, then we're not always quite as good as we think at the city level. But maybe that could be categorized as a national policy dealing with aviation, but at the same time, the complete supply chain doesn't always look as rosy, and that's probably worth mentioning. Yeah. Thanks,
John. It's a good point, but also there is a local impact or a local decision-making point around some aviation as well in terms of approval of new runways and airport buildings as well. The next question from the audience is around the Part Z campaign, which I don't know if people have heard of, but this is pushing for amendment of the planning regulations in order to consider the embodied carbon in buildings at the point of getting buildings reg approval. So the question is, do you think, well, what impact do you think that will have in planning departments? Let's go with John first this time, to mix it up.
Yes, I am aware of this. It's partly being led by a former colleague of mine who worked with me for a number of years. So I think it's an excellent initiative. And there are examples of sort of 30–40% reductions in embodied energy per metre squared, which could be found. No material is without its issues. So we have to make sure we don't go down the language of sort of net zero materials, and it's relatively lower in comparison to standards now. So just to recognise that any building will have an impact as well. But I would say that we have the evidence and the sophistication to be able to monitor it effectively, and therefore put it into the process to reduce the embodied energy of buildings, and it feels a bit like a no-brainer to me.
Thanks. Anthony, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'm aware of them. So in the presentation last year was sort of like was taken through kind of the Plan Z, but it's not something I kind of looked into from a research perspective at all. I guess sort of as John says, I think I'm quite confident that we have the ability to kind of better monitor and to reduce kind of the embodied carbon that's coming through the construction supply chain. In if the numbers are that big, 30–40%, I think that is a really significant benefit, and I think one that it doesn't surprise me that I think that a lot of the industry seems to have coalesced around Plan Z and make quite warm noises about it. I guess kind of where I would be a bit more cautious is moving from that kind of being like maybe a nationally improved kind of government seal of approval, voluntary approach to kind of assessing the whole life cycle of buildings. One would be, I think, I'm not aware if they kind of take into kind of those land use benefits. I think I don't recall seeing that in the presentation, but I think I think that would be an important thing to include, at least within a planning decision, if not the building regulations. But I think as well, I would be quite cautious about making it kind of a compulsory step and kind of making it a discretionary decision, because the nature of individual sites, the nature of individual developments, the nature of kind of the markets for different materials are going to be very different depending upon the nature of the scheme and its timing. And it may be the case that in between two different scenarios, you may have one scheme is viable where you get a 30% reduction in embodied carbon, and another scheme you can actually go further and get to 45%, mandating a very aggressive approach every single time is going to cause damage to the development industry and affect kind of the ability of the construction sector to provide the dwellings and the built environment, increases the floor space that we need. But like I said, I think I'm broadly warm. I think about certainly on a voluntary level, and improving that common understanding of how materials work and trying to regularize that process a bit. I mean, seems to me to be sensible.
Thank you. I think we could keep talking about this for some time, so let's not disappear too much down the Part Z rabbit hole. But I do encourage people who are interested to look up and about it a bit more. So the next question with is one that has crept up in terms of votes, so I feel like I should give it a chance, and that is asking about the barriers to building car light new housing, and pointing out that in the Netherlands it's quite common to get new houses with around 0.2 to 0.3 car parking spaces per house. In all honesty, I don't quite know how that works. Presumably there's some sort of car sharing or agreements on who can and can't have cars. But yeah, just interested to hear whether you think something along those lines is possible in the UK to also get car use down, and how we might go about it. Should we go with John first this time again?
Yes, I suppose when you reach, and this is, I think, one of Ant's key points, is when you reach certain levels of density, you then have the active travel and shared mobility that kick in. And so therefore, having, I suppose, parking spaces and reduced to that level no longer seems that controversial, as it's consistent with sort of the cultural practices and lifestyle of people who live there. So in a way, it may not be something that needs to be mandated, but something that no longer has demand at certain levels. That said, it seems pretty clear that strong justification would need to be required for an underground car park in a new apartment block in London to be let through, for example, and therefore there is an opportunity being at that stage to limit that and to push the boundaries as much as we can. I think one of the issues as well, and interested with the sort of Part Z thing, is how much do we go down a route of voluntary to mandatory, and people probably draw the line differently there. But I suppose one key point to make is, I think, until we foreclose options and we don't drive innovation, and there is a danger that sort of voluntary systems throughout, be it car parking spaces, building materials, if everything remains voluntary, then we're in essence allowing two paradigms to exist at the same time, and that doesn't necessarily reflect the rapid shift that we do. If things can happen at a voluntary level and there's evidence of that, great. It's not I don't have an inbuilt desire for control and regulation, but a willingness to go there when it's not moving at the speed that we would like it to seems like a necessity.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think there's a mixed history of voluntary agreements, and quite often they do get replaced over time with mandatory requirements. Ant.
Yeah, so I think John's totally right. That I think anything on kind of car parking like that, I think it really does depend on spatial factors, right? The urban form, right? It's maybe viable to have far fewer car parking spaces in Lambeth than it is in, I don't know, Lancashire, right? So find somewhere else that's got an L in it. I think there's an interesting, parking is an interesting one in that there's a real dovetail here between kind of planning reform and allowing kind of economic development and addressing housing issues, and also kind of these environmental benefits. Certainly in the United States, where they have quite high parking minimums, so any new house you build has to have parking spaces attached to it. Sometimes it can be very aggressive, and it's 1 parking space per estimated resident of a dwelling, right? So like a 4-person dwelling might require 4 car parking spaces as a result. YIMBYs, so yes in my backyard, planning reformers in the United States are really pushing very hard on this parking minimum question, and they're finding that by reducing the amount of land dedicated to parking or underground car parking spaces, which are very expensive for developers to build, you actually make housing much more viable, much cheaper, and you get big affordability benefits as well. I think in the UK, because our urban form is different, we face kind of any tightening of car parking requirements, we have planning for that, then also needs to think about, well, how do we manage street parking as well? And, is there something we can do around kind of like phasing in a threshold around, well, houses built before date X, you can park, if your car is registered to that address, you can park on the street. From date X onwards, you have to park on private land overnight, and try and internalize that cost of car ownership within urban areas, which should also help make future cars smaller within urban areas. I think there's thinking to be done around that in the UK, but I think you're totally right that there are things we can do around reducing kind of parking requirements with policy that go beyond kind of voluntary steps that actually make housing more abundant and cheaper as well.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask 2 quick fire questions. I feel like one is going to be more suited to one of you and one to the other, so we'll see where we get to, but they both came up and I want to be able to ask as many of the questions that came up as possible. So first of all, there's a question around biomass, and this is very much for John, around biomass-based building materials and whether they could be considered carbon sequestration in the short and medium term. And therefore kind of getting around some of the issues that I think that you expressed around kind of embodied carbon and the impacts of the construction sector and concerns on demolition. And then the other question, which I just wanted to throw in as well, was around urban light rail and whether that could be useful for densifying areas, building new houses along new lines. And this is something again where kind of parts of Europe are ahead of us as well. So they don't naturally sit together, but I just want to put them together in the hope that we've got time to get some answers to both of those before we wrap up. So Anthony.
So I think, I'll take the second one. I'm not qualified to answer that first one. I think there is kind of, when we look at the public transport networks of the big cities of the UK, we did a piece on this a couple of years ago called Measuring Up, looking at how we compare to our European peers, our big cities anyway. We find that in quite a few of our big cities that we don't have as much public transport infrastructure as our European peers do. Some of our big cities do, but quite a few of them don't. So more kind of light rail, kind of urban rail, urban transport, metros, that kind of thing. Definitely part of the package by which we tackle these issues. But I think this kind of gets to sort of the nub of the question, or like the nub of the debate, right? Is that when we're talking about densification and the benefits that derives, what we're actually fundamentally talking about is urbanization, right? So if we're building out on the greenbelt, if we build a new kind of metro line right out into the greenbelt of Manchester, for instance, and we put new houses on that location, that's more car friendly, or that's more carbon friendly than building a car-based estate out in Cheshire, right, which is kind of a less urbanization at kind of a national level and kind of a city region level, and so unlocking those kind of economic and environmental benefits of cities, whether that's through new infrastructure, whether that's through planning reform, whether that's through densification, that's kind of the North Star that should be guiding kind of our thinking on spatial planning and carbon.
Thanks, John.
Yes, so I'll go to the other question then on to do with biomass. And it's kind of it depends. It is possible, of course, to have materials which lock up carbon, and and use timber within that context. But you need to make sure that the whole life cycle is considered of that product. That is done to some extent through environmental product declarations, but at the same time, what happens to the land, where the wood is collected from. There are lots of questions about the whole supply chain process of that. So it's possible, but not necessarily the outcome, and needs to be built in so that that is the outcome, as opposed to just suggesting that it will be, without any sort of specific, I suppose, declaration that this timber and its associated supply chain is low in carbon.
Great, thank you. Actually, I think there's time for one last audience question. And so I was going to ask, there's a question around involving communities in the decision-making process when the planning system is notoriously slow, overburdened, underfunded, and all those other things that we know. Yeah, so I think we have touched on this already, and some of the complexities of kind of trying to engage on these kinds of conversations. But I just wondered perhaps if you've got good examples of how it might be done, or where it is being done well, either of you, that might give people a bit of hope on that front. And do you want to go first?
Great, I'll touch on. So I think, I think in principle, I think moving away from that case-by-case approach, where every planning system is scrutinized, one by one, to a more kind of front-loaded and rules-based approach is better for housing outcomes. I think also the political conflict that the planning system can often generate. So, the classic example of this is estate ballots within London, right, where social housing residents or social estate residents, the council comes to them with a developer and says, would you like kind of a regeneration on this estate? What are the things that you would like if that was to happen? You can either have a swimming pool or a community centre or, a gym. You can't have everything, but what would you like? Getting the kind of involving kind of co-design of that process, and then eventually getting kind of a tick, having a ballot where the social housing residents vote on that. These have generally been really successful across London since they were introduced. So indicating there's actually a real underlying positive majority for redevelopment, under the right conditions. I think in the context of the debate which we're talking about here, if we make the observation that this case-by-case process seems to generate political conflict, we get furious arguments about, I don't know, kind of demolishing, multi-story car parks in Bristol, replacing them with student housing, moving that kind of those trade-offs and those political discussions up to the creation of a local plan and how you apply the local rules within the community, and get people to think, well, we can either protect Bluebell Wood or, this old brownfield site over here, which one do we allocate for development as a site? That's the kind of change which we do need to be seeing, I think, and I think the stuff happening abroad, but also that local estate ballots evidence suggests that it would be popular as well within the UK.
Thank you. So I think that's essentially giving people a choice rather than kind of a yes/no vote, but within certain boundaries. Thank you. John, any thoughts on this question?
Just very quickly, so I had some involvement with the UK Climate Assembly, and also we now have funding to move forward with a citizens panel to explore lots of these more sort of energy demand issues. And I think there is a lot of evidence that if you take people through a proper deliberative process, that actually that they feel part of, that they will recognise the complexity of the decisions. And it's often poor consultation, or consultation instead of engagement, which leads to worse outcomes. And so it is in essence making people part of that process as opposed to a tokenistic effort to pretend that you've talked to them, and then you get a different outcome.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we've ranged across everything from changing cultural practices to revising the whole planning system, and freeing people from their cars and possibly aeroplanes too. So there's a lot to think about. Just to sort of go back to the original kind of question about the value of demolition and rebuilding for densification versus conserving what we have in place already and kind of making the most of those materials. Just to return to that, are there any reflections, having had this discussion, and kind of things that you'll take away from what the other one said, and kind of ways that you can think of that we can manage both of those competing, which and both important sounding considerations at the same time? Ant, do you want to go first on that one?
Yes, I think John's point there about kind of the energy intensity of construction and sort of what our future expectations are is a really important one. You know, maybe demolition is not appropriate today, but it then becomes more viable from a climate perspective kind of 5 years from now. I think, you know, that is an important point. You know, it's not something I've looked into. Yeah, I think that's, you know, I think that chimes and can dovetail quite nicely with an acceptance that, you know, demolition is going to be the right choice for some buildings. And, you know, for not even large parts of the UK's urban form, but there are certain sites that should be allocated for those kind of change. Maybe not tomorrow, but maybe five or 10 years from now.
Thank you. And John, any final thoughts from you?
Yes, so I do see the value of these high dense livable cities, which you know, where we are free from pollution of vehicles, which have in planning systems in the past been allowed to dominate our cities and space, and so therefore I do see the advantages of that. I think we have enough sophisticated quantification of both our kind of climate budgets and allocations over time to align that effectively with how we go about this. But it's about bringing that together. And therefore, this feels like a very planned approach to me, one where we have to actually work out what's best for climate and best for community, and also underpins a future which requires less energy to function. And I think At made that point very well, that this is about securing that we can actually have almost a low energy future in the design that we move forward with now.
Thanks, and thank you both. I think that was really interesting. Slightly different takes, but actually I don't think a million miles apart. I think there's space for agreement in certain areas. So thank you very much, both of you, for taking part, and thanks for all the excellent questions from everyone else. Just to let you know that a recording of the webinar will appear shortly on our YouTube channel. So if you want to watch again or share with others, please do. And there will be more Green Alliance reports in this space in future, I'm sure. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.